Long before Jeff Bezos conceived his retail utopia and conquistadors hacked their way through the jungles of South America, the Amazons inspired both awe and fear across much of the classical world. Despite our continued fascination, the origins of the Amazons are lost among the thick mists of history. Could they be nothing more than a fable? What evidence do we have to support their legend? One theory suggests the word Amazon originates from the Greek amazos, meaning lacking or without breast. Long-standing belief, largely promulgated by the Greek historian Strabo, and later by Roman historian Justin, holds that Amazons would cut off the right breast of infants, presumably to aid them in the use of bows or javelins as they grew older. This is a curious belief when one considers that even well-endowed women in the modern age can be quite skillful archers, and that there are relatively few classical depictions of Amazons in either painting or sculpture with a missing breast. If not simply an imaginary affectation, Strabo's observation could be the result of breast binding or highly developed muscles, both of which could give the illusion of missing breasts. The lack of contemporary examples and the impracticality of the practice would suggest amazos and Amazon are a product of false etymology. It is therefore very possible the idea of breast burning derives from the name and not the other way around. The Persian word hamazakaran, meaning to make war, is another possibility, as well as the Phoenician phrase am-adon, meaning mother-lord. The name could also originate from the Armenian tongue via a word meaning moon-woman. As the Amazons supposedly worshipped Artemis, goddess of the hunt and the moon, this does seem plausible. In a similar vein, author Donald J. Sobol offers perhaps one of the most creative hypotheses when he notes an alternative name of the Hindu goddess Parvati, Uma. Combined with the Sanskrit word Suna, the phrase Uma Suna, or children of Uma, becomes rather intriguing. However they obtained their name, Amazons are first mentioned in the epic myths and poems of ancient Greece as early as the 8th century BCE, specifically in the Aethiopis by Arctinus of Miletus, and its better-known cousin, the Iliad, by Homer. In the Aethiopis, which, like the Iliad, concerns the siege of the city of Troy, 13 warrior women from the land of Thrace come to the aid of Troy and confront the Greeks on the battlefield outside the city. The Amazonian leader, Penthesilea, engaged in single combat with the famous Achilles and was ultimately killed by a savage blow from the latter's sword. In a sad twist of irony, the moment Achilles removed Penthesilea's helmet from her lifeless head, he became hopelessly and tragically smitten by her beauty. The Amazons later make a respectable appearance in the tales of Heracles. For his 9th labor, Heracles was charged with obtaining an enchanted girdle from Hippolyta, queen of the Amazons, and sister of the aforementioned Penthesilea. Accompanied by a group of volunteer adventurers, Heracles made his way to Themyscira, the mythological land of the Amazons. Upon being received into Hippolyta's court, the strong man politely asked for the girdle. Impressed, Hippolyta kindly agrees, and accompanies the strangers back to their ship to see them off. Hera, the ever-meddlesome wife of Zeus, convinces the rest of the Amazons that Heracles and his men were in fact kidnapping their queen. The Amazons grabbed their weapons and descended upon Heracles, who, after mistakenly believed Hippolyta had betrayed him, slew the queen, removed her girdle, and sailed off. Other versions of the Heraclean myth, and there are a great deal many, indicate a rather less cordial initial encounter, as the Amazons engaged Heracles in combat until he slew each in turn, and abducting the princess Antiope for his friend Theseus, who would make the beautiful young woman his concubine upon returning to Athens. More sober accounts, and something approaching objective reality, can be found in the writings of 5th century Greek historian Herodotus, among admittedly taller than average tales of winged serpents in Arabia and ants the size of foxes in the deserts of western India. Herodotus gives a comparatively matter-of-fact account of a group called the Sauromacians, and how they were themselves the product of interbreeding between the Scythians, a catch-all term for people found across much of modern-day Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and southern Russia, and the Amazons. Supposedly, the Amazons had once busied themselves by raiding Scythian villages along the north shore of the Black Sea, until, biological imperatives being what they are, some of the Scythian men paired off with their Amazonian interlopers and sired children. These newly formed families then migrated across the Tanais River and became the Sauromatii, or the Sauromations. Quote, "The women of the Sauromations have kept to their old ways, riding to the hunt on horseback, sometimes with and sometimes without their menfolk, taking part in war, and wearing the same sort of clothes as men." Unquote. Herodotus continues in a somewhat disparaging manner. Quote, "The language of the people is Scythian, but it has always been a corrupt form because the Amazons were never able to speak it properly. They also have a marriage law which forbids a girl to marry until she has killed an enemy in battle. Some of their women, unable to fulfill this condition, grow old and die in spinsterhood." Unquote. 400 years later, the historian Appian recorded the results of a victorious campaign waged by Roman general Pompey against Mithridates IV, ruler of Pontus, a kingdom in Asia Minor. Quote, "There were found among the prisoners and the hostages several women whose wounds were as great and as dangerous as the men's. Those women were said to be Amazons." Unquote. Pompey was quick to press his attack into the frontier of the Caucasus Mountains, eventually reaching the homeland of the Amazons. In his great work, Geographica, Strabo describes the daily life of the Amazons, including farming, raising cattle, and equestrianism. Martial sparring was frequently practiced by the bravest women of the tribe, who from a young age were taught to use a bow, javelin, shield, and sagaris, a type of lightweight long-handled battle axe favored by the Scythians. Strabo continues with a brief explanation of how the Amazons went about replenishing their numbers, interbreeding with members of the Gargarian tribe, keeping any female offspring as their own, and sending males back to their fathers. Although hardly above historical suspicion, the lifestyle of the Amazons related to in Geographica are somewhat at odds with the traditional view that developed over successive centuries. Strabo's Amazons did not kidnap men to use them as communal sex slaves, for example, and rather than bloodthirsty barbarians, they were generally agrarian, taking up arms when necessary only for survival. Ancient Mediterranean histories typically placed the Amazonian homeland on the very outskirts of whatever constituted the known world at the time. This kicking of the geographical can is a common practice, even in recent centuries, albeit for different subjects. For example, in the 1950s, UFO contactees often claimed extraterrestrial visitors came from Venus. In successive years, once probes had landed on Venus and proved the surface to be a hellish nightmare, unsuitable for life, those same extraterrestrials miraculously began to originate from much farther away, somewhere open to speculation. In a way, the Amazons were extraterrestrials of the ancient world. Their origins were mysterious, and visits were fleeting. But whereas victims of voluptuous Venusians were undoubtedly trying to obscure obvious holes in their story, classical historians may have been honestly attempting a best guess. Could evidence of Amazon civilization exist in some part of the world? To Herodotus, Strabo, and others, the Amazons simply came from the east, from unknown lands over the horizon. This may present a clue. In the latter half of the 19th century, several burial mounds known as kurgans in the southern Ukrainian region of Kholodny Yar were excavated by a team including the Count Alexei Alexandrovich Bobrinskoy, a noted and well-respected Russian archaeologist. By careful scrutiny of bone structure, Bobrinskoy soon realized many of the remains found were that of women, an atypically astute observation, as archaeologists rarely, up to that point, devoted much attention to the sex of skeletons, assuming them to be male if weapons were found in the graves. In kurgan number 20, the centralmost grave, typically reserved for a high-status individual or chieftain, Bobrinskoy discovered a female skeleton carefully laid in an east-west orientation. Directly on and around the skeleton was an assortment of finely crafted objects, including silver earrings, a bone and glass necklace, a bronze bracelet and mirror, eating utensils, and a spindle made of clay. Numerous weapons were also laid nearby, such as a pair of iron lance points, an elaborately decorated quiver with 47 bronze arrowheads, and a number of stone bullets. Curiously, at the skeleton's feet was a second skeleton, likely a male. Very little accompanied this second individual apart from jewelry, a pair of small bells, and ornamental pipes. The obvious implication is the female is a warrior of considerable rank, and the accompanying male was somehow connected in a subservient fashion, as he is not laid in a manner one would expect to see a spouse or lover. Perhaps the male was her son. Over the ensuing years, many such kurgans have been discovered between southern Ukraine and the border of Kazakhstan, a swath of land 1,000 miles wide. One particularly notable site, excavated in part by archaeologist Janine Davis Kimball, a location named Pokrovka, dates from as early as 600 BCE to the 2nd century, with each of 50 mounds used and reused by families over the years, some of which containing as many as 25 individuals. Objects found in the graves varied with the presumed station of the individuals during life. 40 of the male skeletons were buried with weapons and were presumed to be warriors. One male was found with the tools of a metalworker. Many women were put to rest surrounded by traditionally feminine artifacts, such as mirrors, spindles, and beads, and still others were found with stone altars, seashells, and carved bones, alluding to their position as priestesses. Curiously, 7 of the Pokrovka females were buried with arrowheads, swords, and daggers, the handles of which had been fashioned to more easily fit a smaller female hand. As weaponsmithing was not a casual business, the obvious implication of this is at least some women in the region were considered capable fighters. The time and effort needed to craft a specially designed sword is far beyond what would be invested for a simple funerary affectation. One possibility is the Pokrovka warrior women were a secondary force used in a more defensive capacity. They may have also acted as the equivalent of a modern-day military reserve, called up for duty whenever the need arose. As Davis Kimball notes, quote, "They were not necessarily fighting battles all the time, like a Genghis Khan, but protecting their herds and grazing territory when they had to. If they had been fighting all the time, more of the skeletons would show signs of violent deaths." Unquote. Obviously, a few warrior women in a tribe of many individuals of both sexes does not translate into a tribe composed entirely of women, but it does make one wonder about a possible connection. Could the people of the Kurgans be the inspiration for the tales of Amazons? About 20% of kurgans thus far found with female remains are in the lower Volga region, corresponding to the land of the aforementioned Sarmatians. Of these graves, arrowheads, lances, bows, and equestrian harnesses are the most common ancillary find, calling to mind the image of a mounted archer. Considering this, there can be little doubt that some ancient women of modern-day Ukraine, Russia, and Kazakhstan fought alongside their men in and around lands geographically adjacent to those of the Greeks and Romans. It is therefore highly probable that at least some later tales of Amazons were inspired by them. To claim otherwise seems willfully obtuse. However, it is somewhat unwarranted to conclude these same women are in some way responsible for the origin of the legend in toto. Accounts of Amazons had likely been in existence at least a century before the oldest known burial site. And while it is certainly possible earlier graves exist, a large majority of those found are at least 1,000 miles away from areas of Amazon activity described by Herodotus and his contemporaries. In the earlymost accounts, classical historians could have first-hand knowledge of some objectively real, exclusively female civilization, physical evidence of which remains elusive to modern archaeology. This seems somewhat improbable, as no artifacts, tools, temples, statues, coinage, or artwork has ever been found to support this idea, Caspian kurgans notwithstanding. The Amazons of the Iliad were said to be well-armed and armored. This implies metallurgical capabilities, which itself implies the technology necessary for smelting and mining, all of which require a respectable amount of equipment and architecture to accomplish. Why haven't we found any of this? Classical historians could also have been referring to what they viewed as common knowledge, simply repeating stories they themselves heard. Of course, this only pushes the question of the Amazons' origin deeper into the fog. Perhaps somewhere along the way, someone found themselves in the grip of creative fever and started inventing things, either to fill in a noticeable gap or to spice up a dull narrative. Of course, human nature being what it is, one does wonder if such proclivities to stretch the truth is limited to those of the ancient world. Whether or not some historically obscure tribes inspired the original tales of the Amazons, their reputation and influence had taken on a life of its own from their first mention. The Hittites once ruled a relatively vast empire encompassing the Anatolia Peninsula and northern Syria, an area including the legendary homeland of the Amazons. A common Greek name for the Hittites were the Alazones, which likely gave rise to the belief among the Greeks that the Amazons, and not the Hittites, were in fact the imperial rulers of Anatolia, which borders on the Black Sea, and therefore fits conveniently in with Herodotus' accounts. As if in a contest to outdo each other, later Greek historians, including Dionysius Scatobrachion, would inflate the epic nature of the Amazons' conquest, first claiming an invasion of Libya, the Greek name for North Africa, and then a pitched war with Atlantis, which the Amazons would eventually win, conquering the entirety of the Atlantic coast of Africa in the process. Skytobrachion further contends the Amazons launched an attack into Asia, but were beaten back by a collective army of resistors. Retreating to Libya, the demigod Heracles counterattacked and crushed them once and for all, ridding the world of the Amazon scourge. Not surprisingly, stories of the now-defeated Amazons continued through the later classical period through the Middle Ages. Stragglers were said to venture as far away as China and hopping across islands of the Atlantic Ocean. Christopher Columbus has been said to have expected to find some remnant of the Amazons, and the idea was always in the mind of many New World explorers, including the conquistador Francisco de Orellana, who, in the 1540s, hacked his way through the jungles of South America and sailed down the mighty Marañón River over the course of 19 months. Having been warned of the Spanish approach, members of the local Piratapoya tribe along the river shouted insults at Orellana and his men, threatening to capture them. With all the patience of men lost in the jungle for a year and a half, the Spaniards opened fire and rowed ashore, engaging in hand-to-hand combat with natives that were led by 10 or 12 very white and tall women. After having won the day, a member of the expedition later noted, quote, "They are very robust and go naked with their private parts covered, with bows and arrows in their hands, doing as much fighting as 10 Indian men." Unquote. It has since been theorized that the tall women were simply larger men in grass skirts and long hair, a not uncommon appearance for the Tapuya and neighboring tribes, but one that was decidedly feminine from a Spaniard's point of view. As far as the white appearance of the natives, dried mud or body paint seems equally plausible. Regardless, de Orellana was convinced he had encountered the warrior women of legend. Because of this, he gave the river its more familiar modern name, Rio Amazonas, or the Amazon River. Clearly, some cultures in the ancient world held women in high esteem, if not viewed them as the dominant sex. It would stand to reason that a certain number of these forgotten cultures encouraged at least some of their female members to take up sword and javelin, either out of necessity or conquest. That such warrior women were a flash in the pan historically isn't surprising. Humanity has been in a state of war throughout its history, and all things being equal, women are not as physically robust as men, and would be at a substantial disadvantage in hand-to-hand combat most of the time. This is an inconvenient fact for some, but it is hard to argue with biology. Assuming that the Amazons, as they are known and described in the classical sense, are a fiction, one has to wonder about the ultimate reason behind their invention. Stories, even those created for the sole purpose of being entertaining, provide either a reinforcement of or present a challenge to prevailing ideas. It is hard not to see the Amazon as scrappy underdogs in a modern light. Other than their supposed conquering of the equally ephemeral civilization of Atlantis, the Amazon always seemed to tragically be on the losing side of a conflict, their way of life ever tenuous. However, Amazons were routinely a Greek boogeyman, or boogie woman, always threatening to attack the peninsula of city-states, as they supposedly did after Theseus of Athens abducted the Amazonian princess. The ensuing battle between the vengeful Amazons and the army of Athens would become the city's greatest triumph. Stories of battles and inevitable victories would inform Grecian artwork for generations and bolster the reputation of martial acumen. As ferocious as they were, the Amazons seemed to be proficient at losing when most convenient. Perhaps the legends are more a testament to the power of ancient propaganda than anything else. It is certainly understandable why modern-day feminists would gravitate to the legend, as it is seemingly tailor-made for both phylogeny and misandry. Then again, it is also hard to separate the idea of a mysterious tribe of domineering females from male sexual fantasy. Being captured by and becoming the object of sexual desire of masses of physically attractive women in need of a proverbial cool drink of water holds universal appeal to heterosexual men. One could even argue a sexualization of the Amazons contains homoerotic undertones, beyond an obviously lesbian motif. Ancient chroniclers regularly described Amazons as man-like in appearance and behavior. One could also argue an army of women that could hold their own in combat, even against someone as illustrious as Achilles, represents the ultimate threat to masculinity. Perhaps Amazons were meant to frighten men rather than arouse them. Amazon warriors of myth continuously acted in emotionally charged, irrational ways. It would be fair to point out the obvious sexism couched in this interpretation, and one might be tempted to declare it as said myth's sole purpose, a convenient straw man in the ancient war between the sexes. But we should remember that the culture of ancient Greece was far from one-sided. Even Sparta, the most masculine of city-states, was renowned for its ferociously independent women, much to the chagrin of Aristotle himself. That isn't to say sexism against women didn't exist in the Peloponnesian Peninsula 2,500 years ago, but any negative imagery of the Amazons were probably put forth to convey universal truth about human behavior rather than specifically female, illustrating strengths and weaknesses within women in a manner in which men could relate. Though they were as imperfect as any of us, the ancient Greeks were not stupid. It would take very little effort by any third-rate philosopher at the Lyceum to realize a society devoid of women would be as colossal a failure as one comprised solely of them. That many supposed intellectuals 2.5 millennia later cannot grasp that obvious truth should not be a comfort. Though the idea that all legends have a basis in fact is somewhat cliché, it is often true. Just what that basis is regarding the Amazons is a matter of debate, and will probably never be answered to everyone's satisfaction, though the ancient graves of Ukraine and Russia certainly seem to fit at least some of the bill. From video games and comic books to television and cinema, the idealized version of the myth, the beauty, strength, courage, and stoicism exemplified by the warrior woman, is celebrated now as much as ever, glorious rebels for some, and worthy opponents for others.